a quick question. When people jump in, do they have to be admitted by you, or can any of the other co-hosts?
I'll take care of it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay.
Let's wait for a bit, Tyson. We have usual people coming in at the last minute here. So.
Sure thing.
This is Southern California, after all.
Traffic, as
Right.
Ruskin wrote about.
Yes, but not that kind of traffic.
Right.
So Gabe, you're gonna choose the readers when it comes up.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we'll start with you and Tyson and Zach.
Yes.
Yep, Zach. This is Gabe. What we're thinking of doing tonight, just to make this a little more informal, is that at least some of the paragraphs that are ones that are on the screen that we have as slides, I'm going to have different people read. So
Great.
I'm not reading everything.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll just kind of toss the ball around the circle.
All right. Sounds good.
And Tyson, don't worry about the spotlighting. I figured out a way to do it and do the slideshow. So no worries there. I'll take care of it.
All right, you got it. Well, Gabriel, why don't we go ahead and start, and we'll
Sure.
keep admitting people as they come in. So thank you all for coming out virtually for this afternoon or evening's talk. I'm Tyson Gaskill. I'm the president of the Ruskin Art Club, which we quietly boast is LA's oldest social club, going strong since 1888. It's my honor and pleasure to have you all here for the informal and participatory presentation you're about to hear, which will be by our very own Gabriel Meyer, the executive director of that same club. It's part of an ongoing discussion we're having in the club about applying Ruskin's ideals to lifestyle choices in the 21st century. One of the key components to this is the concept of the sufficient life, a lifestyle of artful simplicity, mastery of crafts, use of imagination, and ethically responsible consumption. We're having these discussions as a way to think about how we might consider incorporating this into our lives as members, but purely on a voluntary basis. We won't be checking up on you, I promise. Before we formally begin, for anyone who is new here, a few words about our indefatigable host for the evening. Gabriel Meyer is a poet journalist and an award-winning foreign correspondent who's lived and worked throughout the Middle East, the Balkans, and East Africa. He's reported on the Civil War in Sudan, which earned him one of the awards. He's earned honorary doctorates from the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at UC Berkeley and by Lancaster University in the UK. And wow, that's a pretty good gig, getting that doctorate without having to do those dissertations. I kid, of course. I know he's done a lot of work in these areas. But his forthcoming nonfiction work, The Testimony of Stones, is a kind of biography of Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So stay tuned for that. We've been fortunate to have him involved with the Ruskin Art Club since 1998, as he has lectured widely on Ruskinian themes since then, including at Notre Dame University in just 2022, 2 years ago. His essay, Ruskin and the California Dream, appears in the latest edition of the Ruskin Review Journal. Lastly, he's a companion of the Guild of St. George, a charity founded by Ruskin himself in 1871. I could go on, but Gabriel, perhaps it's best if you take it away from here.
Thank you, Tyson. Happy first day of summer, everybody. Happy summer solstice. I think it was supposed to be something like 1:45 this afternoon. Summer happened, so we're delighted. I can't resist, because I'm a journalist, I can't resist starting with a story. and I think I probably may end with one. The Nuba Mountains during the Second Sudanese Civil War, which ended more or less in 2005, and then has been re-engaged in more recent years. I was there as a journalist and later as an advocate in Washington, D.C. For political and diplomatic action to stop the ethnic cleansing campaigns that were going on in the region. The Nuba I knew were living in what might be called, we might characterize as a pre-modern state at the time. No all-weather roads, no electricity, little or no contact with the outside world. They had lived in these semi-arid hills for centuries and had worked out an ecological equilibrium with the land and the difficult terrain. They reverenced old stands of trees, for example. In this rocky, semi-arid landscape, they were precious sources of shade, food in the case of the giant mangoes, and the neem trees in particular had medicinal uses. They buried their esteemed dead beneath these stands, famous Nuba wrestlers, and on the one hand, whose contests provided a kind of divine arbitration for their disputes, and wise old women, which may point to their matriarchal roots as a culture. The Nuba negotiated their mountains on footpaths marked by the prints of generations of Nuba walkers. The paths, I noticed, having to get around on them myself, always went around the great stands of trees and straddled the family graves, little earthen mounds protected from wild animals with bramble mesh. Outsiders like me and like the catechist sent to the area brought something new to this sandy footscape, the tracks of boots and rubber soles. Fast forward a few years to 2005. One of the provisions of the comprehensive peace agreement between Sudan's North and South, I like to call it the non-comprehensive comprehensive peace agreement, involved allowing relief organizations to work in the war-affected areas of the Nuba Mountains for the first time since the late 1980s, and the provisional stationing of a small UN protection force in the area. Without getting into the details of ecological challenges in the developing world or larger policy questions, let me simply describe what I saw as an illustration of a mentality, one we all know quite well. The Nuba, as I have described them, lived with gentle cunning in their environment, organizing their lives on its terms, and one might say deeply inhabiting their world. The UN Protection Force engineers no sooner arrived than they chose a site for their headquarters on high ground, which presented a slight hindrance in the form of an ancient stand of trees. I don't think they knew about the graves. The trees were bulldozed with heavy equipment they had flown in, the site leveled, and in no time a large cinder block bunker was constructed, complete with galvanized metal roof. William Blake's wonderful line from his letters comes to mind. The tree which moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of others only a green thing that stands in the way. Some see nature all ridicule and deformity, and some scarce see nature at all, end quote. To my knowledge, none of the Nuba elders had been consulted about these plans, and there was some discontent among the villagers, particularly about the unwitting desecration of graves that found a voice on market day, but the presence of these outside forces was a form of security after 2 decades of war, and so people decided to keep quiet. In no time, the Europeans who made up the UN station were faced with the region's daunting summer heat, and now without shade and galvanized roofs, cargo planes arrived with generators, fuel for which had to be flown in as well at exorbitant cost, and air conditioning units were set up. The hills now echoed with the constant noise of generators day and night, which also set off the barking of village dogs unaccustomed to the sound. Land Rovers soon appeared, and the Western visitors carved out their own roadscapes, which, needless to say, did not gently negotiate the terrain. In the end, the station proved impractical and was abandoned. The metal roof was pillaged by Nuba farmers who turned it into something useful, like handmade farm implements. In the inability to see the character of the land they inhabited and the genius of the vernacular architecture and patterns of life the people who lived there had adopted, one felt that whatever benefits were being extended, and there were many, whatever calculus was at work, violence, unintended violence, was being done both to people and to the land. As poet Wendell Berry writes of paths, a path is little more than a habit that comes with knowledge of a place. It is a form of contact with a known landscape. It is not destructive. It obeys the natural contours. Such obstacles as it meets, it goes around. A road, on the other hand, even the most primitive road, embodies a resistance against the landscape. Its reason is not simply the necessity for movement, but haste. Its wish is to avoid contact with the landscape. Its form is the form of speed, dissatisfaction, and anxiety. End quote. The situation I've described, for all its many cultural as well as ecological themes, is at heart about a deeply entrenched mentality. The crisis we are facing, I suggest, is not simply or even primarily ecological. It has less to do with the natural environment and everything to do with fundamental perspectives, not only philosophical, but spiritual. Our crisis is a crisis not simply of climate or resources, but the way we envision, the way we imagine the world, the way we perceive the natural order of which we are a part. Let me begin with a quote from Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si on the environment. In a lecture on Ruskin, it would seem I'm quoting everyone but Ruskin, but we'll get there. Laudato Si, in its vision of an integral ecology, calls for an epic shift of perspectives, a cultural revolution. Quote, modern anthropocentrism has paradoxically ended up prizing technical thought over reality, since the technical mind sees nature as an insensate order, as a cold body of facts, as a mere given, as an object of utility, as raw material to be hammered into useful shape. It views the cosmos as a mere space into which objects can be thrown with complete indifference. When human beings fail to find their true place in this world, they misunderstand themselves and end up acting against themselves. End quote. I call this talk Notes Toward a Sufficient Life, and I call it notes for a reason. This is really less a lecture on a Ruskinian concept than a kind of freestyle meditation, my own notes on the lifestyle challenges that Ruskin and other contemporary 21st century fellow travelers are posing to us. I'm offering these thoughts, as Tyson indicated earlier, as a modest kind of provisional contribution to an ongoing discussion. Needless to say, it's much easier to delve into Ruskin, to reflect on him as a thinker, than it is to consider what his ideas might be calling us to do. Applied Ruskin, as we tend to use it in the Ruskin Art Club, applied Ruskin is always a work of improvisation. And there are good reasons for this. Ruskin, of course, is addressing himself to a Victorian audience in the mid-19th century. We must do considerable translating to apply his practical recommendations to radically different times and circumstances. But on the other hand, Ruskin is proposing responses to the challenges of life in an industrial age, only beginning in his day, that resonate with us in many ways at the end of that process, as we enter the uncharted waters of any number of technocratic transitions with even greater force and immediacy. In any case, Ruskin's virtues-based approach to confronting ecological challenge is a forebear of much current ecological thinking, which prioritizes the moral over the prudential. The argument that contends that only moral and spiritual values, personal and societal transformation, can succeed in curbing the thirst for economic goods and the resulting environmental harm our cultural habits have and are wreaking on the planet. There are no technological fixes that are not grounded in what Pope Francis calls ecological conversion. As David Craig has written in an insightful 2001 essay on Ruskin and the virtues and limits of consumption, quote, in addition to Ruskin, we should follow such 19th century figures as Henry David Thoreau and John Muir, who cited the intrinsic properties of nature rather than its economic benefits, and who viewed nature as full of divinity and its protection as a moral test. It's always interesting to note that one of the crucial reasons Ruskin is the complete thinker that he is, the comprehensive thinker that he is, and one of the reasons he speaks to us even today, is that his ideas and principles about nature, art, society, economics, technology, the environment, always come down to the personal, to you, to me, to your life, to your choices. It's one of the aspects of Ruskin's perennial relevance. He is always addressing his readers, appealing to their better instincts, involving them in his thought processes. As many readers of Ruskin would attest, you can't read Ruskin passively. He pulls you in to this argument that he is having in many cases, his struggle to find coherence and patterns. And along the way, Ruskin asks us impertinent questions, his questions, that dissect common cultural assumptions and suggest avenues of complex realignment, asking the deeper paradigmatic questions, even the ones for which we have no ready answers. When you're first reading Ruskin, it's one of the things that startles you, as it must have indeed startled Ruskin's Victorian audiences. Here he is with a wide lens, considering the theoretical ramifications of a principle or an assertion, and without warning, he turns on the reader with a close-up, putting the reader squarely in the prosecutor's gaze. In a famous example in The Nature of Gothic, a chapter in the second volume of The Stones of Venice, Ruskin talks about the implications of the modern search for perfection in design, the effect such standards have on the treatment of workers. And then he gets right into our faces about our choices, our living rooms, the way we live, and the costs our lifestyles exact from the lives of those who manufacture the goods we choose. Now we'll move on to the paragraph, Joseph. And if you'll read this for us.
Absolutely. And now, reader, look around this English room of yours, about which you have been proud so often, because the work of it was so good and strong, and the ornaments of it so finished. Examine again all those accurate moldings and perfect polishings and unerring adjustments of the seasoned wood and tempered steel. Many a time you have exulted over them and thought how great England was, because her slightest work was done so thoroughly. Alas, if I read rightly, these perfectnesses are signs of a slavery in our England 1,000 times more bitter and more degrading than that of the scourged African or Helot Greek, to smother their souls with them, to blight and hew into rotting pollards the suckling branches of their human intelligence, to make the flesh and skin, which is to see God, into leather thongs to yoke machinery with. This is to be slave masters indeed. And there might be more freedom in England, though her feudal lords' lightest words were worth men's lives, than there is while the animation of her multitudes is sent like fuel to feed the factory smoke, and the strength of them is given daily to be wasted into the fineness of a web, or racked into the exactness of a line.
And again, in a few paragraphs later, also from the Nature of Gothic. Tyson, if you'll read this for us.
Sure thing. And all the evil to which that cry is urging our myriads can be met only in one way, not by teaching nor preaching, for to teach them is but not show them their misery, and to preach to them, if we do nothing more than preach, is to mock at it. It can be met only by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labor are good for men, raising them and making them happy, by a determined sacrifice of such convenience or beauty or cheapness as is to be got only by the degradation of the workmen, and by equally determined demand for the products and results of healthy and ennobling labor. Glass beads, for instance, are utterly unnecessary, and there is no design or thought employed in their manufacture. They are formed by first drawing out the glass into rods. These rods are chopped into fragments the size of beads by the human hand, and the fragments are then rounded into the furnace. The men who chop up the rods sit at their work all day, their hands vibrating with the perpetual and exquisitely timed palsy, and the beads dropping beneath their vibration like hail. Neither they nor the men who draw out the rods or fuse the fragments have the smallest occasion for the use of any single human faculty. And every young lady, therefore, who buys glass beads is engaged in the slave trade, and in a much more cruel one than the one we have been endeavoring to put down.
This may be one of the earliest statements about ethical consumerism. For Ruskin, the fate of the natural and human worlds depends on the place of ethics in the economy and on the power of individuals to choose. For every purchase might support another soulless factory, another lost forest, another dehumanized worker. There's a great line at the end of Unto This Last, Ruskin's essays on political economy. Quote, if one due and honest thought over these things, it seems that the kind of existence to which men are now summoned by every plea of pity and claim of right may, for some time at least, not be a luxurious one. Consider whether, even supposing it guiltless, luxury would be desired by any of us, if we saw clearly at our sides the suffering which accompanies it in the world. End quote. And as we shall have occasion to highlight any number of times in this presentation, Ruskin thought that effective solutions rested less on large-scale public policies than on small-scaled individual initiatives, on exemplars rather than programs. Joseph, next slide. Very good. Zach, could you read this quotation?
Yes, I can. Note finally that all effectual advancement toward this true human felicity of the human race must be by individual, not public effort. Certain general measures may aid, certain revised laws guide such advancement, but the measure and law which first to be determined are those of each man's home. We continually hear it recommended by sagacious people to complaining neighbors, usually less well placed in the world than themselves, that they should remain content in the station in which Providence has placed them. There are perhaps some circumstances of life in which Providence has no intention that people should be content. Nevertheless, the maxim is, on the whole, a good one, but it is peculiarly for home use. That your neighbor should or should not remain content with his position is not your business, but it is very much your business to remain content with your own. What is chiefly needed in England at the present day is to show the quantity of pleasure that may be obtained by a consistent, well-administered competence, modest, confessed, and laborious. We need examples of such people who, leaving heaven to decide whether they are to rise in the world, decide for themselves that they will be happy in it, and have resolved to seek not greater wealth, but simpler pleasure, not higher fortune, but deeper felicity, making the first possessions self-possession, and honoring themselves in the harmless pride and calm pursuits of peace.
Not greater wealth, but simpler pleasure, not higher fortune, but deeper felicity, making the first of possessions self-possession, and honoring themselves in the harmless pride and calm pursuits of peace. I first became aware of the theme of the sufficient life in Ruskin from reading Green Victorians, The Simple Life in John Ruskin's Lake District by Vicky Albritton and Frederick Albritton Johnson, published in 2016, which charts the activities of a group of Ruskin associates in the Lake District, principally in the 1870s and 80s. In addition to that, I recommend Frederick's lecture on this subject in the YouTube archive of the Ruskin Art Club, www.ruskinartclub.org, our 2021 Ruskin lecture, The Sufficient Life, Ruskin's Subversive Idea. Even more, of course, I recommend the book. It's a tidy 200 pages and well-written, well-researched, and a challenging study of a long overlooked chapter in the history of environmentalism. Before we sketch out, though, the various ways in which Ruskin's Lakeland disciples sought to realize aspects of Ruskin's pioneering vision of a culture of sufficiency, a century before sustainability, slow growth, and artisanship became part of the modern ecological vocabulary. It's important to examine in some detail, I think, what Ruskin meant by the sufficient life, or as he would have called it, the life of satisfaction. The concept threads its way through much of Ruskin's work, particularly in his notions of political economy, but it's highlighted in the closing pages of Modern Painters, Volume 5, the fifth volume of his magnum opus, published in 1860. This massive work, the 5 volumes of Modern Painters, originally, as we know, conceived as a defense of the aesthetics of Turner against the Academy, morphed over a period of 17 years into arguably the greatest single treatise on art in the English language. Some have called it a meditation on what it means to see. The work also charts the shift in Ruskin's focus from the field of aesthetics to political and social reform, and presages the radical critique of laissez-faire capitalism in the essays of Unto This Last, which appeared in book form in 1862. The reference to the sufficient life, Ruskin doesn't use the term as such. Sufficiency as an ecological concept was popularized in the early 2000s. Ruskin calls it satisfaction, the satisfied life. This appears towards the end of Modern Painters 5 as part of Ruskin's closing reflections. After all these 5 volumes, not, he stresses, a conclusion. Ruskin does not finish Modern Painters. There's no grand synthesis in the end. He simply ends it. So the thing to be desired for man in a healthy state are that he should not see dreams, but realities. That he should not destroy life, but save it. And that he should be not rich, but content. Note that word content. It's a key. Also, the verbs in their positive form, see, save, and be content. The immediate context of this short passage, what comes directly before, is an odd at least at first glance, comment about three forms of asceticism, the forms of self-denial or mortification: religious asceticism, military asceticism, and monetary asceticism. And I'm pulling the text together in a kind of collage of quotes now. We do not come here to look at the mountains, said the Carthusian to me at the Grande Chartreuse. We do not come here to look at the mountains, the Austrian generals would say, encamping by the shores of Garda. We do not come here to look at the mountains, so the thriving manufacturers tell me. In each case, denial blinds the ascetic to the real and therefore leads to self-defeating ends. Ruskin goes on to argue that the power and happiness of human life are only to be attained by a life which is neither speculative, that is, focused exclusively on inner vision or abstract quests, nor productive, exclusively preoccupied with a mechanistic end, but in which A delights in seeing present and real things as they truly are, not dreams. B is not focused on obtaining powers of destruction, but seeks the more attainable powers of affection, observance, and protection. And C does not limit itself to productive accumulation, but delights itself in peace with its appointed portion, is in fact content. So the thing to be desired from man in a healthy state are that he should not see dreams, but realities, that he should not destroy life, but save it, and that he should not be rich. They should be not rich, but content. This is Ruskin's paradoxical asceticism, self-denial in the interests of real life, of life lived to the full. The purpose of the sufficiency, the purpose of the constraints of the self-denial, the self-limitations, is and must be life. Around this thematic statement, he adds several explanatory paragraphs, and this one I find particularly vital. Quote, toward which last state of contentment I do not see that the world is at present approximating. There are indeed two forms of discontent, one laborious, the other indolent and complaining. We respect the man of laborious desire, but let us not suppose that his restlessness is peace or his ambition meekness. It is because of the special connection of meekness with contentment that it is promised that the meek shall inherit the earth. Neither covetous men nor the grave can inherit anything. They can but consume. Only contentment can possess. End quote. Now, meekness deserves a footnote here. It's not a popular word, clearly, in our vocabulary, signifying weakness or servility or helplessness, the perennial doormat. Ruskin's notion is that the meekness celebrated in the quote from Matthew's Gospel from the Sermon on the Mount, the meek shall inherit the earth, is linked to contentment. And that actually is quite helpful and quite accurate. Ruskin read Greek. He was an amateur translator of Plato, was something of a scripture scholar as well, and thus was in a position to know that prautes in the New Testament, which we usually translate in English Bibles as meekness, signify something quite different in Greek. If I'm putting together a number of different lexicons, so this is a kind of, again, a collage definition. Meekness is a temper of spirit which accepts life on its own terms. a kind of poise, an equanimity of spirit, a realism which employs its resources to embrace the challenges of life rather than avoid or resist them. The opposite of self-assertiveness and self-interest, the opposite of the restlessness born of ambition. So in Ruskin's use of it here, the word has steel in it. It's steely, aware, wise, ever vigilant contentment. Ruskin continues, quote, "The most helpful and sacred work, therefore, which can be done for humanity is to teach people, chiefly by example, as all the best teaching must be done, not how to better themselves, but how to satisfy themselves. And in order to teach men how to be satisfied, it is necessary fully to understand the art and joy of humble life. That is, proposing to itself no future exaltation, but only a sweet continuance, not excluding the idea of foresight, but wholly of foresorrow, and taking no troublous thought for the coming days, so also not excluding the idea of providence or provision, but wholly of accumulation. The life of domestic affection and domestic peace, full of sensitiveness to all elements of costless and kind pleasure, therefore chiefly to the loveliness of the natural world." A note on the no future exaltation. In 1858, Ruskin experienced what he called his unconversion from the evangelicalism of his parents, in part at least, because he perceived that within the convictions of many believers about the promise of eternal life lay too often an evasion of the beauties of this world, the gorgeousness of life, and the responsibilities incumbent upon us who live in it. In the same way, Ruskin saw that the modern notion of getting ahead, the drive for wealth and social advancement, too often fed an equally misguided preoccupation with future gains, including illusory future gains, to the detriment of perceiving and embracing the gift of one's own life and consciousness and duties. And of course, Ruskin, knowing his audience, cannot resist a sidebar in which he applies the challenges of the humble life to everyone. Quote, "I believe that an immense gain in the bodily health and happiness of the upper classes would follow on their steadily endeavoring, however clumsily, to make the physical exertion they now necessarily take in amusements definitely serviceable. It would be better, for instance, that a gentleman should mow his own fields than ride over other people's." And as for the poor, Ruskin, as he will throughout his life, advocates for a pedagogy centered on the acquisition of life skills, on education as an ethical process, rather than the acquisition of mere abstract knowledge. Quote, "It may not be necessary for a peasant to know algebra or Greek or drawing, but it may perhaps be both possible and expedient that he should be able to arrange his thoughts clearly, to speak his own language intelligibly, to discern between right and wrong, to govern his passions, and to receive such pleasures of ear or sight as his life may render accessible to him." Ruskin recommends that he be taught how to sing and to see, and in terms of science, he should know accurately the habits and uses of every leaf and flower in the fields, and unencumbered by any theories of moral or political philosophy, he should help his neighbor and disdain a bribe. It brings to mind a great passage in Ruskin's Of King's Treasuries on education as advancement in life. Zach, if you would read this.
Yep. "Mighty of heart, mighty of mind, magnanimous. To be this is indeed to be great in life. To become this increasingly is indeed to advance in life itself, not in the trappings of it. To advance in life without knowing what life is, who means only that he is to get more horses and more footmen and more fortune and more public honor, and not more personal soul. He only is advancing in life whose heart is getting softer, whose blood warmer, whose brain quicker, whose spirit is entering into living peace. And the men who have this life in them are the true lords or kings of the earth, they and they only.
And back to blessed are the meek, the content, for they shall inherit the earth. This whole section on satisfaction or sufficiency appears in the chapter The Hesperid Egle, an iconographical analysis of Turner's 1811 painting Apollo and the Python, which is now in the Tate. Interestingly, as Modern Painters comes to an end after 5 volumes, Ruskin returns to the focus on Turner that so preoccupied Volume 1, the genesis of the whole work. The previous chapter is on Turner's complementary painting Garden of the Hesperides, 1806, which we see in front of us. Ruskin's great allegorical readings of these, in many ways, apocalyptic paintings with the great dragon, it's hard to see here, but the great dragon at the top of the crag overseeing the scene, are his final tributes to Turner, sobered, nuanced tributes in comparison to all the original hero worship. 4 years earlier, Ruskin had supervised the Turner bequest and cataloged nearly 20,000 drawings and paintings. That will do it to you. I mention this because I don't want to do this evening what I and many others before me have done, to pull Ruskin quotes out of context and then use them as texts, isolated from their settings and the arguments and indeed the digressions of which they are a part, the treason of the anthologies. Ruskin reduced to bite-sized, digestible quotes. There's much too much here to try to attempt to synthesize tonight, but I do want to bring Turner's Apollo and the Python into the discussion, because Ruskin does. In our study groups, please join. We do these 8 or 9 times a year. We continue to discover that it's one thing to talk about Ruskin's ideas in isolation. It's quite another to read them in situ, within the framework of allusions and cross-references in which Ruskin has placed them. Not only an enrichment, but often an essential clarification of what he's trying to say. To the ancient Greek, the conflict of Apollo with Python represented the battle of light and color with darkness, of life with death, of purity with sin and disease. Whereas the dragon of the Garden of Hesperides guarded treasure and presided over the scene, this worm of eternal decay in Apollo and the Python, you see him in the upper right of the painting, the corrupter, had been destroyed by the triumphant god, whose bow is before us in the foreground of the painting. This is a Ruskin drawing of the dragon in the Garden of the Hesperides, after Turner. Ruskin thus reads this painting as the definitive Turnerian image of all the battles humanity and nations must fight. And though Apollo, the conqueror of death, healer of the people, kneels here triumphant with his bow, this victory, like all over sin, death, and time, is necessarily qualified, ever to be repeated. As evidence, Turner paints in the wrecked coils of the dragon, a small serpent worm rising out of its blood. In the midst of all the power and beauty of nature, in the face of victory, he still saw this death worm writhing in the weeds, preparing for future struggles with outcomes still unknown. What Ruskin is saying by placing this whole discussion on satisfaction in such a dramatic context, he's saying a lot of things, including something about the trajectory of Turner's career, is to underscore that the sufficient life he's describing is part of a larger spiritual battle. Questions about living a sufficient life are not simply questions of proportion, balance, responsibility, and realism, still less of alternative sources of energy and carbon footprints. They're part of an age-old spiritual battle, and not only with and within ourselves, but with spiritual and civilizational forces determined to subvert our best efforts and intentions. The sufficient life is not a lowering of expectations, but an expansion of them, the embrace of a life which will require the full and sober employment of every human faculty, what Eugene McCarraher has called an ontological imagination, an imagination of being, a life indeed that is no dream. The identity of the dragon in Ruskin's typological reading of Turner's canvases, the primordial enemy, is no mystery. He is the mammon dragon, not money as such, but as Ruskin defines it, quote, the great evil spirit of false desire, false consciousness, or covetousness. This, Ruskin suggests, is at the heart of the battle for the culture of sufficiency. The daily vote, it's a wonderful image, the daily vote for or against covetousness, for or against the dragon. What modern commentators have called the economics of insatiability, the desire for more that is never enough. Ruskin defines covetousness in his letters to the working men of England in the 1870s for his Clavigera as, quote, the desire of possessing more than we have of any good thing whatsoever, of which we have already enough for our uses. Let me try that again. The desire of possessing more than we have of any good thing whatsoever, of which we already have enough for our uses. It is much concerned with pride, but more with restlessness of mind and desire for novelty, for what he has earlier called dissatisfaction. A little cutting here. Okay. Ruskin's career breaks neatly into periods. First, a period dominated by art criticism, by the big books, Modern Painters, Seven Lamps of Architecture, Stones of Venice, 1842 roughly to 1860. Secondly, by the public lecturer phase, 1855 or so to 1884. Ruskin was increasingly concerned that the readers of his large books were principally taken up with the purple prose passages and the wonderful descriptions of nature and the rich prose rather than with his ideas. So he began to go on a long period of time where he was a public lecturer appealing to people directly, including his tenure as the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford, where in addition to giving lectures on art and setting up his school for drawing, he advanced his notions of social reform. One particularly wonderful and eccentric example are the Hinksey diggers in the 1870s. Ruskin dragooned a group of Oxford undergraduates in a character building program of road improvements, drainage schemes in a poor Oxford suburb under the watchful eye of Ruskin's gardener. Ruskin would sometimes join in the work. Some of the Hinksey diggers you'll recognize. They included Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, and the youthful Oscar Wilde. One would give a great deal to have a photograph of that. So it was Tintoretto in the morning and the brigades in the afternoon. As Stuart Eagles notes in his fine study, After Ruskin, The Social and Political Legacies of a Victorian Project, many of the diggers went on to champion social projects in their careers in the whole Victorian and Edwardian ethos of public service. The third phase is when Ruskin moved from writing books to being a public lecturer to the action phase. The action phase, when he moved from London to Brentwood in the Lake District in 1872 and launched the Guild of St. George, still alive and kicking, by the way, to advance his project for the revival of rural economies threatened by industrialization. What made the action phase possible for Ruskin to transition from preaching to doing was the death of Ruskin's father, John James, in 1864, which placed a considerable fortune at Ruskin's disposal. I'm using Robert Hewison's figure of 157,000 British pounds in 1864, with a purchasing power of more than $30 million today. Ruskin's father had built up a singularly successful sherry import business, and this fortune permitted Ruskin to translate some of his ideas into practical philanthropic ventures. For example, one of his first projects was to fund Olivia Hills, later one of the founders of the National Trust, her self-reliance-based social housing initiatives in London. Another factor in what we might call the character of Ruskin's action phase was his 1872 move, following the death of his mother, from London's Denmark Hill, where he had lived most of his life, to the Lake District. Ruskin had grown increasingly unhappy in Greater London, especially as Denmark Hill, once on the leafy outskirts of the city, became an urban London suburb, complete with mass-produced Ruskinian Gothic housing tracts. As he wrote in a letter in 1872 to the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette with rueful humor, "I have had indirect influence on nearly every cheap villa builder between Denmark Hill and Bromley, and there is scarcely a public house near the Crystal Palace but sells its gins and bitters under pseudo-Venetian capitals copied from the Church of the Madonna of Health or of Miracles. As one of my principal notions for leaving my present house is that it is surrounded everywhere by the accursed Frankenstein monsters of indirectly my own making." Ruskin is referring here, obviously, to the Gothic revival that he had so much, that he did so much to inspire. Ruskin bought the Brentwood estate on Coniston Water in 1871. It is said, sight unseen. The 18th century house was run down and repairs and additions were made before Ruskin moved in, especially the turret, which allowed Ruskin to survey the whole west side of the lake. This, of course, is a view of Brentwood today from the lake. Once ensconced at Brentwood, Ruskin launched a series of projects exploring the possibilities of sufficiency. But the move to Brentwood was even more ambitious than that. At his house at Brentwood, overlooking Coniston and the Old Man of Coniston, the great hill to the west of the village, Ruskin launched a moral crusade against mass consumption and urban life. Back to the Green Victorians. As the Albritons write, Ruskin laid out a garden to determine what a working man might be able to manage if he had his own allotment. He studied native plants and shunned greenhouse exotics. He collected geological specimens to display in local schools so that children might develop a greater connection to the landscape. Physical labor and exercise were moral aims in themselves for Ruskin. Often he donned a pair of rugged trousers, went outside and worked with his own hands. At a time when wealthy men employed housefuls of servants, as he did himself, it was something of a marvel to see an Oxford professor chopping wood. Joy, you can move on. Yeah, this is a view of the old man across the this great fell, maybe 3,000 feet high, across the Coniston Lake from Brentwood. And then another view of the old man of Coniston from Ruskin's dining room, just outside Ruskin's dining room at Brentwood. Ruskin also traded help with translating Xenophon's Greek in the morning with his secretary, W.G. Collingwood, and the younger man's brawn in the afternoon to help him expand a little Brentwood skiff harbor on the lakeshore. He built a reservoir and redirected the waterfall down the hills, adding a slate seat or throne that faced the tumbling stream and craggy rocks rather than the lake, so that he could closely observe the fauna and flora of the hillside. And this is that very slate chair. Ruskin's worker-oriented Guild of St. George, into which Ruskin poured his resources, aimed to enrich the lives of laborers, shopkeepers, and other workers without much formal education through artistic workshops and community gardening. In all these projects, Ruskin sought to teach people about the natural world, lure them away from conventional consumer habits, and broaden the ideal of the good life. Ruskin also purchased land, initially in Totley near Sheffield, but the agricultural scheme established there by local communists met with only modest success after many difficulties. Donations of land from wealthy and dedicated companions eventually placed land and property in the Guild's care in the Wyre Forest near Bewdley, called Ruskin Land today. 100 acres of old-growth forest Ruskin saved from a coal mining venture and 4 other locations. The Guild also underwrote educational ventures in the heart of the beast, in the industrial hell of Sheffield, where Ruskin created a unique museum for manual workers and their families, an eclectic collection of artworks, architectural casts, drawings, rare mineral specimens, and samples of missals and rare book bindings. The museum operates to this day in downtown Sheffield. It didn't take long for Ruskin's presence in the Lake District to draw disciples and associates. Among them, his faithful secretary, W.G. Collingwood, with his family. That drawing of the old man of Coniston that you saw earlier was Collingwood's, and Albert Fleming. These were eager to join the effort to create in the Lake District a working laboratory for Ruskin's social, economic, environmental, and educational theories. Fleming, a lawyer, a key Ruskin disciple, helped organize an important contribution to rural economy, the Landale Linen Industries, which addressed an urgent local issue. Mechanization had put many rural women spinners and weavers, particularly widows, out of work and without means. Fleming, with Ruskin's support, helped organize them into a collective, the Landale linen industries, which found niche markets for their textiles, particularly for the reticella lace that is even today called Ruskin lace. Unfortunately, the collective hadn't counted on the importance of obsolescence. Their cloth was so well made that it never wore out, which affected profitability later on. But few would argue that Susanna Beaver was the queen of the Lake District Ruskinians. Ruskin called her Queen Susan. This was one of the deepest and most consequential friendships in Ruskin's life. Susie Beaver was a supreme confidant and in many ways a mentor to Ruskin in his embrace and cultivation of the sufficient life. As Green Victorians notes, if Ruskin's theory of life as wealth was to have any teeth, someone would need to prove in practical terms that a simple life in the country was not just a series of deprivations suffered by the poor or by those otherwise constrained. Someone had to live there permanently and consciously appreciate that life every day for decades without serious regret. They needed to be satisfied with this life. Ruskin traveled, after all. This gave him ample reason to value Beaver's contentment and wonder. She was the sufficient muse. A Beaver letter to Ruskin in 1873, shortly after they met. Ruskin was abroad at the time. Quote, "Do you ever send home orders about your Brentwood? I have been wishing so much that your gardener might be told to mix quantities of old mortar and soil together and to fill many crevices in your new walls with it. Then the breezes will bring fern seeds and plant them, or rather sow them in such fashion as no human being can do. When time and the showers brought by the west wind have mellowed it a little, the tiny beginnings of mosses will be there. The sooner this can be done, the better. Do not think Susie presumptuous." Susanna Beaver was born November 2nd, 1805 in the north of England. She lived almost her entire life in the Lake District town of Coniston in a cottage called the Thwaite. The Thwaite was a veritable laboratory of local flora and fauna, the magnum opus of the Beaver sisters. One admirer called it, in conception and arrangement, unlike any garden outside the realm of dreams. The Beaver family were known for being authorities on local botany, and as well, Susanna Beaver was interested in poetry, drawing, and painting. She was a strong supporter of ragged schools, which provided free education to destitute children, too poor to pay for schooling, and too unkempt or undisciplined to attend Sunday schools. In 1853, her pamphlet letter, "Foodless, Friendless in Our Streets," was published, which encouraged more support for the Ragged Schools Union. The union had started in 1844 with only a few schools, and it would by 1870 have close to 400 registered. She met John Ruskin in 1873, and they became close friends, writing each other almost daily, even though they lived just across the lake, about their shared interests in nature, art, and a love for animals. In 1887, Albert Fleming edited and published a selection of these letters, Hortus Inclusus, the enclosed garden. Contact lessened with Ruskin's declining health in the late 1880s until Susanna Beaver's death at the age of 88 in October 1893. Close friends in death as they were in life, John Ruskin and Susanna Beaver are buried near each other in St. Andrew's Churchyard in Coniston. The tall cenotaph there is Ruskin's grave, and next to it, the smaller crosses are the Susan, her sister Mary, and other members of her family. Ruskin is also surrounded by the family of his secretary, W.G. Collingwood, and his cousin Joni and her cousin Arthur. So he's literally surrounded by family and associates in St. Andrew's Churchyard in Coniston. A full view of the character of that friendship, because of the sheer number of letters that they wrote to each other, close to 1,000, and the institutions that have thankfully preserved them, among them the Huntington Library in San Marino. In fact, just this last fall, I was able to sit with Dinah Birch, and we went through, I think, 3 boxes of Ruskin Beaver correspondence that are stored there at the Huntington Library. 2 books published in their lifetimes that are testimonies to this fruitful exchange. Frontes Agrestes, an anthology of excerpts from modern painters chosen by Beaver, and Hortus Inclusis, as we mentioned before, a selection of Ruskin's letters to Beaver. I'm going to briefly just read 4 excerpts from those letters, just to give you a sense of the relationship, and also of this remarkable group of ecological pioneers. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to counterpoise this with drawings. Ruskin's drawings have, of course, since the beginning of the 21st century, attracted more and more attention as the remarkable works of art that they are. But again, it must be remembered, and it's referenced in these letters, that Ruskin drew every day and drew what he saw, and drew oftentimes for friends. It was really a part of his record of seeing, and the fruit of friendship, particularly these associates in the Lake District. Quote, "The whole household was out after breakfast today at the top of the moor." This is Ruskin writing to Beaver. "The whole household was out after breakfast today at the top of the moor to plant cranberries, and we squeezed and splashed and splattered in the boggiest places the lovely sunshine had left, till we found the places squashy and squeezy enough to please the most particular and coolest of cranberry minds. And then each of us choosing a little special bed of bog, the tufts were deeply put in with every manner of tacit benediction, such as might befit a bog and a berry, and many an expressed thanksgiving to Susie and to the kind sender of luxurious plants. I have never had a gift for you, dear Susie, more truly interesting and gladdening to me, and many a day I shall climb the moor to see the fate of the plants and to look across to the thwaite, what loveliness everywhere in a duckling sort of state just now." Another letter. "You know, I am getting my Oxford materials gradually to Brentwood, and whenever a box comes, I think whenever there are any I don't want myself, which might have leave to live on Susie's table. And today I found a very soft purple agate that looks as if it were nearly melted away with pity for birds and flies, which is like Susie. She was an animal lover. And another piece of hard wooden agate with only a little ragged sky blue here and there, which is like me. And a group of crystals with glass of epidote inside, which is like what my own cascade has been all winter by the garden side. And so I've had them all packed up, and I hope you let them live at the Thwaite. Oh dear, the cold. But it's worth any cold to hear that delicious robin dialogue. Please write some more of it. You hear all they say, I'm sure." Joe, if you move on. And then to the peacock feathers. "If you only knew the good your peacock feathers have done me, and if you could only see the clever drawing I'm making of one from the blue breast. You know what lovely little fern stalks of sapphire the filaments are. They beat me so, but things are coming along." And finally, "Behold, Athena and Apollo both come to bless you on your birthday, and all the buds of the year to come rejoice with you, and your poor cat is able to purr again, and is extremely comfortable and even cheerful today. And we will make more and more of all the days, won't we? and we will burn our candles at both beginnings instead of both ends, and every day beginning two worlds, the old one to be lived over again, and the new to learn our golden letters in. Not that I mean to write books in that world. I hope to be set to do something. And what lovely receptions you will have in your heavenly thwaite and celestial teas. The whole village is enjoying itself, I hear, and the widows and orphans much the better for it. And altogether, you and I have a jolly time of it, haven't we? Some of these letters of the mid-1880s have a valedictory quality. As the Albritons note in their study, Ruskin's high hopes for a new kind of moral economy were wedded to apocalyptic anxieties. Among them, Ruskin's realization that far from isolating him from the effects of industrialization, the move to the Lake District had only underlined the pervasive character of industrial damage to the environment that affected everyone. The storm cloud had followed him to Brantwood. Ruskin's cloud studies Ruskin's cloud studies, a feature of his life since the 1840s, now revealed, especially after 1871, that something new and profoundly troubling was happening to weather patterns in the Lake District. In 1884, Ruskin gave one of the last of his public lectures, actually two lectures, The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. It's a much commented on lecture these days, a kind of proto-environmental warning about climate change. They're not the most coherent of Ruskin's lectures, but perhaps that's due to their character as chronicles of Ruskin's decades-long meteorological observations, his cloud studies, that seem to indicate that something new and profoundly troubling was happening to weather patterns all over the world. Ruskin called it the storm cloud. Just going to read one quick excerpt. The sky is covered with gray cloud, not rain cloud, but a dry, black veil, which no ray of sun can pierce. And almost everywhere the leaves of the trees are shaking fitfully, as they do before a thunderstorm, not only violently, but enough to show the passing to and fro of a strange, bitter, blighting wind. While Ruskin's carefully documented meteorological observations were widely dismissed at the time, crazy old Ruskin, by the early 20th century, scientists were connecting the dots and establishing the relationship between industrial pollution and changes in the atmosphere. By the late 1880s, Ruskin began his long retreat from public life. Increasingly brittle mentally, he had resigned his Oxford professorship, finding it harder and harder to concentrate, and in the grip of a growing conviction that he had failed in his efforts to inspire societal change. While his Guild of St. George, his attempt to create an ideal rural farming community, soldiered on, public support of his philanthropic efforts had never been robust. Finally, in 1889, he suffered a mental breakdown from which he never recovered and retired to his estate in the Lake District under the care of relatives, where he died in 1900. Of course, it's always useful to point out, I can't go into great lengths here, we may talk about it in the discussion, but just at the point, excuse me, where Ruskin was most despaired that he had had any real effect on societal change. At that very time, when he'd withdrawn from the world, there was this whole period in the late part of the 19th century, saw wildfires spread of Ruskin societies and reading guilds devoted to studying Ruskin's ideas and enacting his reforms. In 1904, Mohandas Gandhi read Unto This Last and launched his agrarian movement in India on the basis of it. When we think about Ruskin's concepts of social reform, again, we are apt to think first about broad policy implications. There are implications for public life, for the shaping of law, for government-directed initiatives. That was certainly the way many of Ruskin's social ideas were applied in the 20th century, particularly in Britain, where Ruskin is one of the patron saints of the Labour Party and an inspiration behind the evolution of the modern welfare state. In fact, some scholars speculate that one of the reasons Ruskin largely disappeared from public discourse after World War I was that so many of his social ideas, social security, free public education, workers' rights, public housing, healthcare reform, had become commonplace aspects of public policy. It's worth noting, however, here that Ruskin's own plan of action, as we have noted more than once, placed more emphasis on the countercultural measures, on inner transformation, and on personal responsibility, on the power of choices, of individual choices, and of group choices, and the lifestyles that would emerge from those decisions. We have arrived at the beginning. So the thing to be desired for man in a healthy state are that he should not see dreams, but realities, that he should not destroy life, but save it, and that he should not be rich, but content. Thank you. Oh, yes. Tyson, if
Wow.
you want to...
Yeah. I'll jump in here. Thank you so much for that wide-ranging and thought-provoking series of notes, which came full circle after a pretty wide walk around Ruskin's life and intellectual output.
Yeah.
We're happy to entertain some questions now. I mean, that was, as I said, pretty thought-provoking. So I'm sure some of you may have something that you're going to want to say. I'll use the presidential prerogative to start. So Gabriel, Ruskin definitely embodied that philosophy of giving back or paying it forward, as we say now. How do you think he would feel about travel today? You know, like say international travel. To me, it might offer up some contradictions between the importance of improving oneself. I mean, just learning more about the world versus the greater knowledge we have today about the environmental costs for doing so.
Yeah, I think basically Ruskin, Ruskin was not a Luddite. I mean, Ruskin thought you had to make prudential decisions about the use of technology. But he thought you ought to ask very deep questions when you did so. That you ought not to be seduced, by the lure of efficiency or something like that. That you needed to ask very deep questions. I think about someone like Wendell Berry, for example, who has steadfastly refused to use a computer. And despite everyone's appeal to him that about all the advantages that would be there, he's simply sort of taken this position that he wants to approach that technological tool with some caution and to invest himself in technologies that don't use it. It is interesting always to me that there's the very funny story that tells it. Not Wetterberg, Cook. Cook tells the story that there was this kid who fancied himself a Ruskinian. He wouldn't send a letter through the mail So he would take notes to people's homes. And he would, abjured the use of all technology. And so he walked all the way from London to Brentwood to meet Ruskin and to win, of course, his approval. And when he presented himself to Ruskin, and told him that he'd eschewed using the railways, Ruskin called him a young fool. And Ruskin just said, "Look, I despise the railways. I don't want them in the Lake District. I fight them on all kinds of levels, but I use them. And there are times when I use them." So the young man. So Cook says the young man left the master's home thinking that it was a tragedy that Ruskin wasn't a true Ruskinian.
I guess there are many interpretations of Ruskinian then.
Well, again, it's just to say these are prudential choices. But I think what Ruskin would say is make sure you're asking the deeper question first. Don't just simply make some decision off of the shallower part of the brain pan. Think deeply about these things because they are profoundly meaningful. They shape us, and as Ruskin would want to say, is also, what's the network look like? What's the effect? What's the map of the effects of that action? How does it impact other people, situations? So those are the deeper questions.
Bernie, looks like you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. I would like to thank you, Gabriel, for a wonderful presentation. It is so wonderful that I'm not going to ask a question, but I will make an observation. An observation that among other things, the sufficient life is a magnanimous life. As for one of the quotations that you made, which I think most salient here. I realize that we have far too little time to discuss this, and I don't want to put you on the spot. But could you point in some directions where we might figure out how to live the satisfactory, the magnanimous, and the good life?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when we did the symposium, we did a symposium in 2018, the Ruskin Art Club at USC, on Wendell Berry. You were present, and you remember that moment where after we had a whole day on Wendell Berry's poetry and then on Wendell Berry's essays and all these speakers, and some audience member stood up and he says, "So what are we to do?" And I remembered that at the time, taking out my trusty copy of The World Ending Fire, The Essential Wendell Berry, and pointing to two passages. Let me just find them here. Actually, I think they're in my notes. Where pages. Oh, yeah, okay. The lists are page 147. I'm going to do the other one first, 334. Yeah, I mean, there are people who live this, who live this life, who are thinking very deeply about those kinds of questions of practical action. And Wendell Berry is one of them. And there are two lists in his works. At the end of the essay, The Future of Agriculture, he says, what must we do? And he lists, first, we must not work or think on a heroic scale. In our age of global industrialism, heroes too lightly risk the lives of people, places, and things they do not see. We must work on a scale proper to our limited abilities. We must not break things we cannot fix. There is no justification ever for permanent ecological damage. If this imposes the verdict of guilt upon us all, so be it. Second, we must abandon the homeopathic delusion that the damages done by industrialization can be corrected by more industrialization. Third, we must quit solving our problems by moving on. We must try to stay put and to learn where we are geographically, historically, and ecologically. Fourth, we must learn, if we can, the sources and costs of our own economic lives. Fifth, we must give up the notion that we are too grand to do our own work and clean up our own messes. It is not acceptable for this work to be done for us by wage slavery or by enslaving nature. Sixth, by way of correction, we must make locally adapted economies based on local nature, local sunlight, local intelligence, and local work.
In short, we must put our houses in order.
And there's a seventh. We must understand that these measures are radical. They go to the root of the problem. They cannot be performed for us by any expert, political leader, or corporation.
Therefore, we must do it ourselves.
And see that this is really a kind of riff off of what Ruskin was doing in the Lake District, inhabiting a single situation very, very deeply and living and learning and being instructed, out of that experience. Small, contained, relational, responsible.
Thank you for this, Gabriel.
Yeah. So what I'm saying, I mean, there is guidance out there.
Does anybody have a follow-up to that or a different angle that they want to explore? Victoria. You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much. That was a really, really rich and fabulous talk. I'm very glad it was recorded because there are a lot of gems in there. I couldn't help but think of Goethe and Tolstoy during this whole talk, and I was wondering, was there any was there any connection in the sense of sort of a through line in terms of this this sort of really heady mixture of social justice, ecology, creativity, literature, philosophy, spirituality? I mean, it's just it suddenly I thought, oh, there's almost like a triumvirate if you put Ruskin in there with them. So I just wondered about what you might think of that.
Yeah. Well, Victoria, there was a lot of contact between Tolstoy and Ruskin. They corresponded, and when Ruskin died in 1900, Tolstoy wrote a testimonial to Ruskin that was published in English papers that that said he was one of the greatest men of our time, and then went on to say that he says, I believe that what Ruskin thinks now, that almost no one thinks, somehow in the future everyone's going to think this. Interesting.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I didn't realize that. I'm still a novice when it comes to Ruskin.
Yeah.
What about Goethe? Did Ruskin look back to Goethe in any of the, even the sense of like school children with rocks? There's so many little details that reminded me totally of Goethe and his house in Weimar.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Actually, I don't know whether there was anything, whether Ruskin took anything directly from Goethe, but the example of the artist who is a scientist, who's interested in every aspect of everything. And I think also the other thing that Goethe would be so attentive to would be the dangers of theoretical formulations that rather than the direct engagement with something on its own terms, rather than coming at something with a theoretical framework, which then turns it into an example, an illustration of your theory, rather than this engagement with the thing itself. That was something that Ruskin routinely excoriated the kind of geologists of his day for, that they weren't engaging scientific issues about both mineralogy and geologic issues with, as he called it, with the innocent eye, the eye that was simply open to receiving what was there, rather than trying to straitjacket into an ideological box.
I love
That's
that.
very Goethean, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. And then it begs the question of Rudolf Steiner, but I see that we're running out of time, so to be continued. Thank you.
How about one more? Laura's got her hand up. Go ahead, Laura.
Sure. I'm all, as I know, Gabriel, I'm so struck by the parallels between Thoreau and Ruskin.
Absolutely.
And have written about Thoreau's reading of Ruskin, and yet I can't find any evidence, but then I don't know Ruskin's work particularly well, that Ruskin actually read any of Thoreau's work. And yet it just seems impossible that he, I mean, I guess I'm asking, is there any convergence here, or is this a case of kind of parallel evolution producing this similar kinds of formation, social and individual sort of ethical, moral, in these two very radically different environments?
Well, Laura, I'm so delighted that you're here tonight. It's an honor to have you here, and I've always enjoyed so much your talks on Thoreau's Thoreau's quiet arguments with Ruskin.
Yes.
Just
Yeah, but
reading
it was a
Ruskin
very
and then
productive
arguing
and
with him.
stimulating. Yeah.
It's wonderful. Yeah, I've never found any. It could be there. I've just never found evidence that Ruskin knew about Thoreau. I mean, he knew about Emerson, and
Right.
and he met Emerson. They didn't get along very well. I never quite understood what happened at that meeting, but they.
Yeah, that would have been
Yes.
to have heard their conversation.
Yeah. So
if Emerson mentioned, I have a young friend who reminds me of you, something on those lines.
Well, and Ruskin had read Emerson and liked
Yeah.
some things that he said. So we do know that he read American authors, and he knew about. He certainly knew Emerson.
So I guess the sort of fascinating question there is, if there isn't because we always want to sort of draw lines of influence. Somebody thinks this because they read so and so, or there's some kind of thread that ties people together. But if they're not actually in mutual reciprocal communication, then you've got a really interesting situation where it's a kind of parallel evolution where you've got different people in different places confronting the rise of industrial modernity and consumer culture, and working through what shall we do then? What is our moral response? And coming up to essentially the same answers, the same kind of answer. And that's fascinating in itself. Partly because it does give agency to human person who feels helpless, right? I am pinioned by these changes. I can, what can I do as Ruskin at the end of his life? But nobody's listening. I can't do anything to create social change. But, you know, as a teacher, when you can find something like these teachings that you can pass to students and say, don't be discouraged if you can't change the entire world. You know, you have some agency over how you live your life.
Right.
And that at least is something to give you a kind of life project to hold on to and stay sane with.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's true. It's also it's always very interesting to look at those various figures who had this very difficult relationship with Ruskin as a thinker, but yet drew on him.
Yeah.
Thoreau being one, Muir being the other. Muir
Oh,
has
really?
Muir has the same. Where he'll write letters to other people or write notes in the margins of Ruskin books, arguing with him, and you know, and all of this. So
Yeah. I can see that. Two very independent, even cussedness American male
yeah,
thinkers.
yes. I think what particularly bothered Muir, I know, was Ruskin's tragic sense of nature. The nature
Yeah.
wasn't simply this temple, holy spiritual temple,
Right.
but nature was wounded, as man is
Which
wounded.
I think Thoreau was coming to, and it would have, had he lived even 10 years longer, I think we would see much more of that dimension coming in from Thoreau's reaction to what he saw happening around him. But you know, he didn't live long enough to sort of develop. We don't have a fully mature Thoreau, in other words, which is kind of a loss for us all. Thank goodness Ruskin lived long enough to give us these three periods of life that you've drawn so not
And it's
just
interesting,
usefully,
this
but
third period,
inspirational. Yeah.
this third period is really just now being written about. You know, who were these associates and what kind of life did they have? And it's quite extraordinary, the whole Lake District, group.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. We were trying to keep this to an hour and a half, but Zach, you had your hand up. Do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, if I might, I just Laura's comments there about the Thoreau-Ruskin connection got me thinking, and there's sort of a similar parallel without clear connection also between Ruskin's writings on labor that come out of the Stones of Venice in the 1850s that very closely parallel Marx's 1840 manuscript on alienation and the nature of creativity. And so again, sort of an example of two thinkers. And Ruskin was not reading in German, and the 1840s manuscripts didn't come out until much later. So there was something in the ether for people who were approaching and looking at these issues and then arriving at very similar places.
Yeah, I think we were looking at it analytically, asking the right questions. I love, you guys hear me say this all the time, but I love Bernard Shaw's comment about Ruskin and Marx in 1920 at the Ruskin centenary celebrations. And Bernard Shaw says, the difference between Marx's invective and Ruskin's invective, he says, and why Ruskin's was so much more effective, he says, Ruskin's invective was delivered utterly without malice. This is wonderful insight. And you feel that even when he's raking his audience of these burgers of Brantford over the coals, you certainly feel he's appealing to them. You know, that he wants them to get it.
Well, I think delivered without malice is a great kind of concept to end on. It's Gabriel, thank you so much.
Certainly.
For that. That was tremendous. And I hope we can turn this into a small printed piece as well. We need to talk about that because there's there's so much to unpack there. You really led us on a tour.
Well,
Thank you all
sure.
again for coming. Please do visit our website, ruskinartclub.org. You'll see a calendar of upcoming events. One of them coming up next month is Friday, July 19th, where we will be doing a tour of the amazingly Ruskinian biodynamic regenerative Apricot Lane Farms in Moore Park. It's a near miracle, and we think it's a template for farming in an increasingly over-fertilized, water-scarce world. So we hope to see some of you there. And that's it from me. Gabriel, unless you had any last.
Nope, terrific. Thank
Okay.
you, Tyson. Thank you, Joseph, for all your help with this.
Thank you all for coming out.
Great.
Okay, good night.
Exactly.